So I will welcome you all again, and also thank Joe and Alma Gildenhorn for funding this series, the first one of the season. And we are absolutely delighted to have Anthony Appiah here with us today. I strongly recommend the book, and I'm sure all of you, after you hear this, will be interested in getting it. How Moral Revolutions Happen, The Honor Code. You all have a biography of Anthony Appiah, so I won't go into it in great detail, but it's a remarkable man if you haven't heard him at Aspen events before or elsewhere. Born in London, where his father was a law student, returned to Ghana, where he spent much of his childhood. His father, a very distinguished lawyer and diplomat. His uncle and his great-uncle, both kings of the Ashanti region of Ghana. His mother, a distinguished English novelist, hailing from a very distinguished family that Anthony spent time with when he was back in England. His grandmother was the widow of a gentleman who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he comes from enormously distinguished family lineage in both England and Ghana. He was educated early in his life in Ghana, and then in Gloucestershire and Dorset, and eventually the University of Cambridge as an undergraduate, and also where he did his doctoral work. And from there began a very distinguished career in philosophy, which has since branched out to many ancillary fields. He's also a novelist. He's written not only important works in aspects of philosophy like semantics that probably many of us don't have much time to read, but also in popular culture, African history. He's collaborated with our good friend Skip Gates, who's an Aspen trustee. Matter of fact, he's told me he's heading off to Boston for Skip's birthday party, so we all wish him a very happy birthday. And I think probably you've been familiar with some of his previous books. But today we're going to talk about this work, which I also think is a wonderful book in the Aspen context. Many of the things, of course, that we discuss here in these sessions are either speakers or people who've written about important topics in contemporary public policy. But the roots of the Aspen Institute, of course, are very much in the humanities and even in moral philosophy. A number of you in this room, I know, have taken the Aspen Seminar, which we used to call the Executive Seminar, and it's still at the heart of much of what we do at Aspen, and sort of is the spirit behind the way in which we operate. And we still have many people each year who gather together to ask questions about how do one lead a good life, a very Aristotelian question. What is the concept of a good society? And this book is very much in that tradition. And one of the things that Anthony tries to do here is restore the concept of honor and how it relates to human dignity to a very important place in the philosophical canon. But before we jump into the book and the wonderful things that he describes in the book, both historically and then contemporary issues, I guess I have to ask if what your reaction was to the sort of pre-book launch event to get everyone thinking about honor in Washington. Of course, Glenn Beck's Restoring Honor. I mean, is there some significance to his choice of the word honor, and it relates to why you think this is such an important concept?
Well, I do think it's an important concept, and I do think that and I do think, as he does, there's a problem about America's honor. I suspect that we have different views about what the source of our dishonor is, but I think that honor is actually central to something that's very American, whether you're of Glenn Beck's politics or some other kind of politics, which is patriotism. Because I think that if you ask what the central preoccupations of patriots are, they have to do with the the honor and shame of your country. I mean, the psychology of patriotism manifests itself in pride when your country does honorable things and shame when it does dishonorable ones. And if someone tells me they're a patriot and doesn't manifest pride when we do great things and shame when we do bad ones, I don't believe them. Now, they may fail to, and so the thought, my country right or wrong, which is said to be a patriotic thought, isn't the thought that you're on the side of your country, you agree with your country whether it's right or wrong. It's the thought that your fate, your honor fate, is tied to the fate of your country when it's doing bad things and when it's doing good ones. I hope that everything I just said would be uncontroversial between me and Glenn Beck. I mean, then when we started picking the sources of dishonor, we might disagree. But I hope that it can be as it were, a multi-partisan thought that caring about the honor of your country is an important thing for people who care about their country to care about, and that it is very important, especially, I think, in a democratic republic, where we are jointly charged with the responsibility of making the big decisions about who's going to run the system, and then giving our input in public debate about what we shall do. One of the stakes that you have in that isn't just that the government does things for you and so on, but that it's your honor. Your honor is tied up with the honor of your country. If you have that kind of patriotic engagement, which I find myself with in the United States, even though I'm a late comer to American citizenship. I wasn't born an American citizen. But I do find myself proud when we do the right thing and ashamed when we do the wrong thing. And I guess that makes me a patriot.
Well, we'll come back to this notion of national honor and the role you argue that it plays in many moral revolutions. But before we do that, how do you define honor? I mean, what?
Right. There are good reasons why philosophers recently have been a bit unwilling to answer definition questions in the way that they used to be thought to be committed to. It used to be that philosophers just began everything by defining things, partly as a result of work in the philosophy of language, which I could talk about, but it wouldn't interest you, and partly for a number of other reasons, I think. Philosophers are less inclined to offer kind of paragraph-long or even sentence-long definitions anymore. So I want to say that I don't want to give a kind of necessary and sufficient conditions, old-style definition of honor. But I want to say that these are the things that you should look for when you're trying to identify where honor lives in a society. First, honor involves, and I think this is close to his definition, it involves an entitlement to respect. So if you have honor, you are entitled to respect of a certain sort, positive respect. If you have honor, you are entitled to respect because there's some code, this is why I talk about honor codes, that allocates respect. Characteristically, honor codes assign respect to people differently depending on their identities. Different things get women honor and men honor in many societies, most societies. Different things in early 19th century Britain brought honor to gentlemen from the ones that could bring honor to working people. So identity plays into these things in that way, and the sort of the conditions you have to meet in order to count as worthy of respect depend upon your identity or standing, often in some system. And finally, I think in any honor system you've got to have both individual honor, that is, entitlements to respect where the respect is directed at you for things that you have done, achievements of yours, or qualifications of yours which aren't achievements. And some kind of collective honor, where you can gain honor, as I just suggested we do when our country does great things, without actually doing anything yourself. Many Catholics have been shamed by what's happened recently, by the uncovering of this appalling history of abuse of children in the Catholic Church. The people who are ashamed about it are not just the people who did it. Unfortunately, they're not shamed enough. It's other people who feel their stake as Catholics engaged in this, and of course there are Catholics who feel proud of John Paul II. I mean, there are lots of things for Catholics to feel proud of as well. So I think those are kind of the things that I would go into the mix of saying that's what I'm talking about when I talk about honor. I'm talking about an entitlement to respect. I'm talking about an entitlement to respect that's associated with codes and identities. And I'm talking about something that you can get individually, but also that is in virtue of things you've done or failed to do, but also because of things other people do with whom you're connected by these large identities.
The book, of course, is not about honor per se, but the role that honor plays in moral revolutions. And by moral revolutions, you talk about not necessarily changes in attitudes, but actual changes in behavior and substantial changes in behavior over a short period of time. And to do this in the book, you look at three particular historic moral revolutions. And I think let's talk a little bit about those and then how we might apply them to other issues. The collapse of the Duel, the end of and particularly in the context of Britain, the end of foot binding, which was a practice that lasted 1,000 years among the elite in China, and the end of Atlantic slavery. But you really focus on the abolition movement in Britain. And in each case, you argue that the moral arguments about those practices being bad practices were well known and for a long period of time. But that wasn't enough for those changes to come to an end. That dueling, you said, was always murderous and irrational. Foot binding was always a hideous and painful and crippling practice, and slavery obviously always dehumanized people. So first of all, why did you pick those three? And then let's look at each one a little bit. What attracted you to, why the duel?
Well, I thought if I'm going to write about honor, I need to have one case which I can use just to explore the kind of psychology of individual honor. And the duel seems like a perfect topic for that. And there's a fine, I'm a philosopher, not a historian, so there has to be a fine secondary literature on the topic for me to be able to say anything interesting at all. And there's a fine secondary literature on dueling. And also, so when I was casting about for things to work on, and when I knew I was going to write about honor, the more I learned about dueling, the less I realized I already knew. For example, I had no idea that dueling was murder under common law in England from at least the time of when Francis Bacon was Attorney General and Lord Chancellor in succession, obviously not at the same time. I had no idea that it had been anathematized by the Church both as early as the 9th century and that the Council of Trent, in that moment when the Catholic Church is re-establishing its definition of itself after the Reformation, took time in the midst of talking about serious theological matters to say that to reiterate the point that dueling is a sin, that it's a form of tempting God, and that it should, and that actually what the Council of Trent said was that a prince who authorizes dueling doesn't need excommunicating; he's excommunicated himself. And finally, so it's illegal. It's
against the established church.
Against the established church. Remember, England is a country where the head of the head of state is the head of the church. It's a deeply established religion. It's against the established religion. It's against the law. Everybody understands it's immoral, partly because they understand the reasons why the church is against it. It's, for one thing, it's a breach of the fifth commandment. Thou shalt do no murder. It looks like two guys setting out to murder one another. And finally, especially in the Enlightenment, when sort of reason comes to be a major topic of conversation, everybody understands it's a completely crazy practice because who wins doesn't depend on who's right. And,
nor even who's a good aim.
No, because the 18th century dueling pistol is a fantastically unreliable weapon. And many of the people who engaged in it, I discuss at some length in particular. So anyway, so it's everybody's against it, and everybody feels they have to do it, right? I mean, everybody knows all the arguments. So something has to shift. People recognize, even people like David Hume, who thought the duel was ridiculous, and he was unusual in thinking that, nevertheless says that it's a noble thing to do. And even he, who understands all the arguments against it, feels the pull of honor. And so one of the first things that the duel establishes beautifully about honor is that honor has no guaranteed connection with morality. That's the thing that I think the philosophical tradition, the early philosophical tradition, the Aristotle, sort of gets wrong. Aristotle thinks that, as it were, honor is part of morality. Honor is a powerful normative system which can be aligned with morality and which can go against morality, as it clearly does in the case of the duel. So that seemed to be an obvious one to begin with.
And the other thing that I didn't know was just how widespread it was.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have this idea that it just happened occasionally, and of course we have our own famous duel here in 1804 with Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. But, I mean, there were thousands of people who died dueling.
Yes.
In England and France?
England, France, Russia, Italy, Germany, Spain, the United States. It's a very widespread practice. And if you look back and see what the dispute was about,
Yes.
Cheating at cards. Well, I mean, cheating at cards is a very bad thing. Me and my nanny were both against it. But a capital offense, and so on. So I think it just brings out how powerful honor is, how separate it is from the other normative systems, law, religion, morality. But notice that it can be allied with them as well. So one of the powerful things that honor does in almost every society where there are these honor codes, and there is something like this in every society, is helps sustain truth-telling, because it's almost always highly dishonorable to lie. And there's a case where morality and honor agree. So anyway, so dueling was a good one. Foot binding struck me as interesting because that was the one that led me to this topic in the first place. I wrote a book about sort of global ethics on cosmopolitanism. I was interested in the history of conversations across societies about moral questions. I knew that missionaries and elite businesswomen from the West had played a role in the end of foot binding in China. And when I was looking at it, what it says in the literature is, in many places, they gave it up because it was a stain on the national honor. And I thought, there are many good reasons to give up foot binding, but that's very low on my list. You know, how about it's cruel to girls? How about it hobbles women? And so on. Now, those things obviously played a role in it because it had those features that it became shameful.
But it was also illegal for
the Manchus
a couple of hundred years.
The Manchus banned it when they took over. So the whole of the whole of the Qing dynasty, they didn't put a lot of effort into. I mean, they tried in the beginning. They thought they could stop it. They failed, and they sort of lost interest in it and moved on to other things. But it was always not popular with the governing elite, and it was, in fact, the only people against whom it was enforced was that Manchus, who had their feet bound. That was regarded as a very, very bad thing. But they sort of gave up trying to force the Han Chinese to stop it. Nevertheless, so none of the emperors had their feet bound. I mean, none of the empresses. You couldn't be a concubine of the emperor if you had your feet bound. So because they were all Manchus. I mean, the ones who were eligible to be empress. So anyway, so I read this thing, and I didn't have time to sort of go into it when I was working on that other book. So I sort of put it in the back of my mind, you know, how could it be that this obviously abhorrent practice only gets into trouble when it's seen as an honor problem. And that was what led me to this, what I think is a sort of discovery, which is that in these moral revolutions, the arguments are all sitting there, waiting, as it were. Everybody knows what they are, the arguments against. And it's when honor is turned, when honor comes to be at stake, that then finally you can sort of get a movement. Now, there are other things going on. I'm not a historian. I'm also not a sociologist. And the sociology of mass mobilization, that's also an important part of this. And both in the case of dueling, and in the case of foot binding, and in the case of slavery, there were anti-slavery societies, anti-foot binding societies, there was an anti-dueling society, which the Duke of Wellington belonged to after he had his duel. So that's an important part of it too. But it seemed to me that in the minds and hearts of the leaders of these societies, or in the case of England, of the working class anti-slavery, the sense that you had an honor stake was something turned out to be more powerful than the thought that it was wrong.
So let's go back. What ended the duel? You talk about the Duke of Wellington,
Yes.
and one of the most famous men in Britain, the Prime Minister, and he goes off into Battersea Park.
Yes.
And the consequences could have been colossal.
Yes. I mean, so this was the thing that I sort of hadn't grasped until I looked into it. The Duke of Wellington, the greatest living Englishman, the most famous man in Europe, the victor of Waterloo, the conqueror of Napoleon, the hero of the Peninsular Wars, the hero of the Raj, who had fought battles all over India, Prime Minister of England, and therefore the first minister of the head of the Church of England, right? And he feels perfectly free one morning to go out with a pistol and point it at another member of the House of Lords, Lord Winchelsea, and shoot at him. Breaking the law, breaking Christian duty, and offending the king, presumably. Though the king was delighted, as it happens, because the king was, part of that caste too. So it was his law that was being broken, but he thought it was wonderful. Wellington does this sort of completely amazing thing, and there's some dispute about whether he should have done it because if he had been shot, this was a period of political instability. It's a little bit before the Great Reform Act. There's a lot of Jacobin activity and so on. The idea of the Prime Minister being shot in the middle of this thing would have been destabilizing, especially because he was dueling with Lord Winchelsea, because Lord Winchelsea was the leader of those who were opposed to Catholic emancipation. And he was dueling with him because the Duke of Wellington, in part, had changed his mind and was now supporting Catholic emancipation in Ireland. And Lord Winchelsea thought he was defending the Crown and the Church by breaking canon law and the law of England. So the fact that the subject of the duel was a deeply political subject. A subject was dividing the country. Millions of people were writing petitions about this at that moment. Was a reason not to have the Prime Minister shot in the course of a duel about it, right? So it was politically completely irresponsible. And he was not a famously irresponsible man. He was, the leading gentleman of England, as it were. So, nevertheless, that's what he did. He fired, and there's a dispute about whether he tried to kill Lord Winchelsea, because in duels you can't tell, these pistols are not terribly reliable, and anyway the Duke of Wellington was the worst shot in England. It was a famous fact that he was constantly hitting people when he went shooting for, grouse.
Sort of like Cheney.
He was like Cheney. He was the Cheney of the early 19th century. He went grouse shooting with people. You had to stand a long way away because he regularly shot people who were grouse shooting with him. There's a wonderful story told by Lady Shelley of being on a hunt shooting thing with him, and he shot a woman who was hanging on the estate, who was hanging her laundry out the window, and Lady Shelley said to her, "Stop complaining, woman. You've had the honour of being shot by the Duke of Wellington." Anyway, so we don't know whether he was trying to shoot, but what we do know is that Winchelsea did this and fired in the air. So Winchelsea made it plain that he was not trying to kill the Duke after the Duke had fired a shot at him, which was a conventional way of ending the duel and saying, okay, I'm ready to apologize, which he did. But he didn't think he could apologize until the Duke had had a shot at him.
So why was this one of the last duels? What happened?
Well, so, yes, sorry, I got distracted by the details there. I mean, the point is, there was dispute about whether he should have done it for these reasons of what was at stake. He was basically too important to be entitled to pursue his private honor in this way. But there wasn't dispute that it was okay for a gentleman to do it. And while there was some mockery, it was mostly it wasn't from within his own class. Some regular people thought it was ridiculous, and I have in the book, the only picture in the book is a cartoon of the Duke of Wellington's duel, which is clearly mocking him, and there were a lot of those, and part of what happened had to do with changes in popular attitudes and not in elite attitudes. But when just a mere 20, 30 years later, there were a few of the things that, many of whom, which get called the last duel in England. There's several of the last duels in England. But they are ridiculous. Within a generation, if a gentleman challenges another, as one of the characters in Evelyn Waugh's novel Officers and Gentlemen says, somebody says to him, what would you do if you challenged a duel? And he says, laugh.
Yeah, they became subjects of ridicule
Completely
instead of honor and dignity.
Right. In other words, the honor system itself turned against dueling. Instead of being a source of honor, it became a source of embarrassment. And in fact, if you killed somebody in a duel, it was shameful. So, in about a generation, this is why I think it's appropriate to call it a revolution, in 20 years, it moves from being this thing that everybody understands a gentleman must do in certain circumstances to this thing that it's ridiculous to do, and if you do it, and a few people who sort of lost track of what was going on did, they would be articles in the London Times mocking them.
And the same kind of speed occurred in China.
Yep.
Over a rapid period of time. I think you say in one particular region it was 99% of the elite women were bound, and 20 years later, none of them were.
Right. It goes from 95 bound to 95 unbound in a generation, and that doesn't just mean. Think of the consequences. It also means that people had shifted from thinking, "I will allow my son to marry only footbound women," to thinking, I will allow my son to marry only women.
Non-footbound.
And so if you got your footbound, if you hit the thing at the wrong moment, you became unmarriageable to a respectable family. And that's, for 1,000 years, it's a condition of elite marriage. You can't become the wife of a member of the hand literati of an exalted kind unless your feet are bound. And then it varies a little bit around the country, but that's basically the truth. And then in 20 years in that place, but typically everywhere it changed about 20 years. There's this sudden flip. Now the people who still had their foot bound, you can read interviews with these women in the 30s, and some of them actually were alive into the 1990s, but very, very ancient ladies. But there are a lot of interviews with sort of vigorous young footbound women in the 30s, and they want to show the interviewers their beautiful feet. And one of the striking things, I think, again, for me, there are many things I didn't know about foot binding, but one of them was how proud many of the women with their bound feet were of their feet. There were contests. You didn't show the foot; you showed it in a silk shoe. But the contest was to see who had the smallest feet, and you would get praise and admiration if you had very small feet. And these women showed them foot bound and unbound to interviewers and said, "Isn't that lovely?" And if you look at it, you think, that looks like a grotesquely malformed, foot.
Well, we'll come back to honor in the context of women when we look at honor killing in Pakistan. But let's first talk about slavery. And there's some different things about slavery. Obviously, unlike the footbound women, slaves didn't think slavery was a good thing.
No.
And but similarly, the moral arguments against slavery were clear, were well understood. And yet, in that period in Britain, the change was dramatic and it was widespread across all classes. And what did you find were the causes of that particular moral revolution?
So there are two phases of anti-slavery in Britain, because first the slave trade is abolished in 1807 after a campaign of less than 20 years. And then in the 1840s, slavery in the British colonies is abolished. I mean, in the West Indies in particular, which is the most important place in terms of numbers. There's huge amounts been written about. The first thing everybody knows about Wilberforce. I thought I would look at the second thing, the process of actually getting rid of slaves. And the striking thing, again, about this, if you read the literature, is the involvement in British politics when, remember, working people do not have the vote at this point. That comes in the 1860s, around about 1860, I think. The first working class members of English Parliament, I think, are in 1862 or something, and they were both miners. They're not voters, and they're subjects of the crown, obviously, and therefore they're objects of legislation and political concern. But in the 1830s and 40s, working men's associations were involved in anti-slavery in a country where there were no slaves, in England, because Lord Mansfield had said that the law of England didn't recognize slavery. In England, it recognized it in India and in Africa and in the Caribbean, but it didn't recognize it in England. So whatever the exact legal situation is a bit unclear, but everybody basically thought that if a black slave stood on the soil of England, he was free. That's basically what people thought. It was a bit more complicated than that in reality, as things often are in the law, but that was basically what people thought. So no slaves in England, and of course working people didn't have slaves. And to the extent that they had an interest, a material interest, many of them were part of a new working class, an industrial working class in the north, in the mills.
Working on cotton
textiles. Where did the cotton come from? Slavery in the United States and the Caribbean. So they had no economic reason for being against it.
You disagree with those historians who say that abolition became popular when its economic value declined.
At least with these people, their interest lay the other way.
And so it was a widespread moral revolution.
Yeah.
And so why were the working class in England so opposed that it could lead to this?
So I have a theory about this, which is, I said to you earlier, I haven't been able to find anyone articulate this theory already in the literature, but the literature on slavery is too vast to have surveyed it all. But it seems to me that, if you look at the evidence, this is a very plausible view. What they cared about, what they saw with great clarity, was that slavery equated manual labor with dishonor, and they were manual laborers. So they couldn't accept a system in the world that meant that only dishonored people could do the very thing that identified them. In the 1840s, you get for the first time large numbers of things called working men's associations. So they're not just working men, they're men who identify as working men. And the thought that, what does that mean? It means they work. And work in this context means manual labor, work with their hands. To have in the world, supported by your government, a system that equates that sort of thing with dishonor, well, that's dishonoring you. And so, of course, you're against it. You don't have to care about the slaves at all. It doesn't matter what happens to them. Right? I mean, of course, some of them did have evangelical reasons, for example, for caring about slaves as fellow humans. As "Am I not a man and a brother?" is one of the slogans of the evangelical movement. But the point is, you didn't need that, because honor, the idea that the working class had honor, is already beginning. That's what makes, for the first time, real working class consciousness in England, is the thought that it is not just a working person or a member of the lower orders isn't just someone who isn't a gentleman. It's someone who is.
So in a sense, it was working class sort of recognition of their own dignity. Yeah. And the numbers are, you talk about revolutions, it really was a revolution. I was struck that in a petition in 1833, 20% of British males over 15 signed a petition against slavery, which you extrapolate in the book would mean in the United States today 23 million people signing a petition. And even with the internet, I don't think that's conceivable on any issue.
Right.
So there obviously was this
And
huge...
remember, most of them didn't have the vote. And this was a petition to Parliament. So they were claiming a say in the affairs of the nation. And what did they choose as the topic around which to claim it? Slavery. The only other topic on which there are as many petitions in the period, and they don't have anything like the same huge numbers, but there are large numbers of them, is the topic of the duel between Winchelsea and Wellington, which was Catholic emancipation, which most English Protestants were against.
Let's move this to issues today, and then we'll open it to the audience as well. You talk about those three particular moral revolutions, and then you apply what you've learned from that to moral revolutions you clearly would like to see happen. And the one you talk about most of all is honor killing of women, particularly among Pashtuns in Pakistan. And tell us about Samyasawa, or however you'd like to bring us into this horrendous practice and what it might take to stop it.
Right. I just want to begin by saying that in each case I picked a particular place. So I talked about dueling in England, I talked about foot binding in China. I talk about honor killing in Pakistan not because it's the only place where it occurs. I do not wish to give the impression that I think that Pakistan is the only place where honor killing is a problem. It's probably the case, though numbers are hard to come by, that it's the country with the largest number of honor killings in a normal year, as it were, in an average year. But there are large numbers in all kinds of places, Turkey, India. They're not all in Muslim
And we're not talking
families.
About single digits or
No,
dozens.
no.
We're
So
talking
there are thousands of women. And there are very large Muslim countries like Indonesia where it doesn't happen basically at all. So I want to say all that because there are so many sort of distorted pictures of what's going on here. But nevertheless, it's a serious problem in Pakistan, and just to be clear, it's illegal. You can get fatwas signed by any number of Muslim legal authorities saying it's anti-Muslim, and that's true across the world. Grand ayatollahs in Syria, people in Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the Great Mosque in Cairo, which is not called Al-Aqsa, I've forgotten its name. Yes, and people and 40 Pakistani.
So it's not in the Quran,
guys.
it's not in the
It's not in the
Sunnah,
Quran,
not in the
and it's
Hadith.
explicitly argued against. And one of the reasons it's bad is not a reason that's high on my list of reasons for being against it, which is that it's taking authority away from the people who should punish breaches of the law of in relation to zina, which is sort of things like adultery and sex outside marriage. But nevertheless, it's not Muslim. And in fact, in the places where it occurred before they were Muslim places. As it occurred in Catholic Italy until well into the 20th century. So that's all important because of the prejudices that are around this. But it is a very important problem in Pakistan. And it's a country where there's a significant proportion of the world's honor killings in any year. I can promise you there were a couple last week because without looking at the Pakistani newspapers. And it's not just a practice of sort of peasants beyond the view of the state. And so I start with the story of Samyasawa, who's the daughter, she's dead, the daughter of a very prominent businessman in the Pashtun part of Pakistan, in Peshawar, who was the head of the whatever it's called, the business bureau, as it were, in that town. His wife was a gynecologist. The young woman herself, Samia, was a law student. She was the wife of a medical doctor. These were elite Pakistanis. She was trying to get a divorce from her husband, who was also her cousin, and one of the mediating figures trying to help them in this was a senator, a member of the Senate of Pakistan, a very distinguished human rights lawyer. And her lawyer, Hina Jilani, was one of the most distinguished women human rights lawyers in Pakistan, and in practice with her sister, who's the head of the human rights, in Pakistan. So, elite context. What happens? They think, the lawyer and she think that they have persuaded the family to permit the divorce. The mother is invited to the lawyer's office. They've been told they can't bring any men from the family, but the mother says, I can't walk, I need this man who wasn't a member of the family. I need him to walk on his arm, so I can walk on his arm. The man comes into the lawyer's office, pulls out a gun, shoots this woman's daughter in front of her lawyer, and then the woman leaves, the mother, apparently completely unperturbed. And the man who actually does the shooting was killed by a bodyguard of because this sort of thing might happen. They actually had someone around. His job was to stop it happening, but he didn't succeed. So we don't know anything much about him because he was dead within a few minutes. But she was killed in front of her lawyer, in front of a very prominent lawyer, after a promise mediated by a senator of Pakistan that things were okay. All right. Not only does this happen, no one has ever been prosecuted for this. And when this very distinguished member of the Senate of Pakistan tried to get the Senate of Pakistan to condemn it, he couldn't get more than 4 signatures. And he got people from the Pashtun Parliament.
Only 4 in the Senate.
4 in the Senate. And he couldn't, so he couldn't get a motion even discussed. And to the extent there was discussion, there was a defense of the family by a senator who came from that part of the country, and of its concern for their honor. And they referred to her in the most derogatory terms as a little girl. This is a woman in her 30s, late 20s, who's a law student and has kids. Little girl, they compare her with prostitutes and so on, and all she's trying to do is get a divorce, which her family is against, even though she hasn't lived with her husband for years and years, and even though the family agrees that he was abusive towards her. So it's not just something that happens among peasants. And when it does happen in the elite, it doesn't get condemned. I mean, Benazir Bhutto condemned it, but lots of elite people didn't. So and yet, all these people know it's illegal. All these people know.
So how does this moral revolution happen? Is it just like in China that if something enough happens that people think it's shame on Pakistan?
I think that's. So, I think that's at the heart of what needs to happen. We have to. What we need to do is to mobilize honor against honor killing. Right, and we know from these other historical cases that honor codes can be shifted, right? In 1830, it's part of the honor code of English gentlemen that you kill people when certain things happen. In 1850, Cardinal Newman says it's a mark of a gentleman that he never causes anyone pain. So you can have shifts in codes, and you can have them under the pressure of concern for honor. In this case, 2 kinds of honor are obvious. One is Muslim honor, because Pakistan is not just a state, it's a state that was created as a state for the Muslims of South Asia, in which, as it says in the preamble to their constitution, for it to be possible to live a good sort of Muslim life. I'm paraphrasing wildly. So I think those are the kind of honor stakes that there are for this for Pakistanis. It really is true, after all, that we think shame on you for allowing this, that we think shame on the Senate of Pakistan for not being able to muster a thing. And when Asma Jahangir, who was Hina Gilani's sister, responded to this, she said absolutely the right thing immediately. She said, what kind of honor is it to kill an unarmed woman, right? She's not just drawing on notions of national honor. She's drawing on an internal tension within this code of honor. She's pointing out that within this code of honor, in which protecting women is also an important part of what you do, right? Killing a member of your own family is something that there's already, as it were, an honor reason not to do, even though there is also an honor reason to do it. And I believe that the internal honor pressure and the combination of that internal honor pressure with the pressure that derives from the honor stakes of Pakistanis and as Muslims means that and we see this. There are many organizations now in Pakistan working against this. The law has been significantly improved.
You just raised an important point too, though, is how helpful or unhelpful is opprobrium from overseas?
Good.
Is it for all of us to say shameful, and Pakistan how shameful this is? Does that make it worse? I think of analogous kinds of things. Whether it's female genital mutilation. I couldn't help but thinking about that when reading about the foot binding. Yeah. Where you have in some cultures, And again, it's not in the Quran, it's not Islamic, it tends to be in Islamic countries, but there's nothing, it's religiously forbidden, but it happens. I mean, you have mothers and grandmothers causing this atrocity to occur. But does it help for outsiders to say this is shameful, or does it fortify it? And then, of course, I mean, the most probably significant of all that we'd look forward to a moral revolution to end is suicide bombing and the killing of innocents. I mean, those people are martyrs. They're honored in those cultures.
Right. And as long as they're honored, we've got not a hope of stopping it. So we've got to get the people. It's not so much a matter of changing the minds of the suicide bombers. It's a matter of changing the culture that sustains them. And the culture that sustains them is one, as you say, in which it can be, in a really important, relevant to them honor community, a source of family honor to have died in this way, in the right kind of causes. Just to be clear, suicide bombing as a tactic wasn't invented by Muslims. It was invented in Sri Lanka largely by the Tamil Tigers, which was a famously non-religious organization. It had Christian Tamils in it, it had Hindu Tamils. It didn't have many Buddhists in it, but that's not too surprising. But it was not a and it wasn't argued for on the grounds that it brought you honor or anything in the afterlife. It was argued for on the grounds that it brought you honor in this life, or honor to you to your memory and to your family. And so while that stake is there, it doesn't matter that it's also the killing of innocents, which people are likely to recognize at some level of their being is not what you should be doing. We have to figure out how to make it seem shameful. Now, you asked absolutely the right question, which is it helpful? Or when is it helpful? I think the answer is it's that what you might call the nationalist backlash is a very big problem in exactly this kind of moral conversation across societies. And it's happened over and over again that the moral, the kind of finger wagging from outside has actually led to an increase in support for a practice, because the outside, and what's it about the outsiders that makes this happen? Well, first of all, if the outsiders look like they don't know what they're talking about, then why should you take them seriously? So if we want to criticize any of these practices, female genital cutting, suicide bombing and so on, we had better talk about them in a way that shows we actually understand in some detail what we're talking about. We mustn't sound as though we just don't know what. If we sound as though we don't understand honor at all, then nobody's going to listen to us in any of these things. So you need the vocabulary of honor, and you need to show that you understand the vocabulary of honor in order to be taken seriously, I think. And what I think I learned mostly from the Chinese case is that the really successful cross-cultural interventions occur against a background in which there's ongoing respectful dialogue between the participants. So those mostly evangelical, Anglophone, English-speaking missionaries in China who were the leaders in this, they learnt their Chinese, they studied their Confucius, they learnt to write beautiful classical Chinese of the sort that you had to have in order to pass the exams to be a member of the Mandarin class. And they just made it absolutely clear that they understood that there was something great about Chinese civilization and that this was therefore a blot on it. If you criticize honor killing in Pakistan as a typical Muslim practice, which it isn't, so there you're already out of it because people know you don't know what you're talking about, and you criticize a typical Muslim because you think that Islam is hopeless, Muslims are like Nazis, as a distinguished member of our political elite said the other day, then nobody's going to listen to you. Now, obviously, if you think Muslims are like Nazis, then you have a different, you're going to have to do something other than have a respectful conversation. But I don't think that Muslims are like Nazis. I don't think that Pakistanis are like Nazis. There are some very bad Pakistanis, but then there's some very bad Americans, and that doesn't, and some of them do things that I'm ashamed of. But I'm trying very hard to stop them, to get in their way when they do things, at least in public, things, in the name of the public. And I think there is a powerful body of Pakistani organizations, often led by women, but not exclusively so, that are working on this topic. And probably the most helpful thing we can do is whatever they ask us to, whenever they ask us for their help. And we can help them in lots of ways. And if I may just sort of end by saying this, one of the reasons why people are helping is another example of the power of honor. Many people are helping because they understand that honor killing is about dishonoring women. It's not about dishonoring Pakistani women. It represents a view in the world, as it were, about the inferiority of women. And so many of us, some women, some not, who think that that's a deep mistake, are engaged with this question from outside. And of course, women in particular are engaged with it because their honor is at stake. Swedish women's honor is at stake, right? Not just the honor of women in Pakistan, not just the sense that women in Pakistan are entitled to that respect, which is denied them when their honor murdered. That engages all of us. And so honor is at work in connecting us with this issue. It's at work in what I believe is necessary to make progress on the issue. And it's the problem. And so I don't think you can do much about this one. And I think the same is true with something slightly different about some other of the gender problems in the world today. I don't think you can do anything about it unless you start thinking about honor.
Well, thank you. Fascinating discussion, fascinating book. Let me open it up. I think we have 2 microphones, and because we are videotaping this, please wait for a microphone. And first right here, and then...
John Alterman. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm wondering, it's hard sometimes to think about things in 20-year cycles, especially when we're talking about customs that have gone on for centuries or longer. Is the proximate cause of the change in these moral codes, is it because of some issue of ripeness, a very deep set of societal changes, or do you think it's about tactics, that you have leaders who are trying an approach that hasn't been tried before that is able to push something over the top? Obviously both are involved, but which one, as you look at these, was more important?
There are many things going on in each of the cases, and one of the big background things that's going on in England, which I talk about a bit, is clearly a shift in the meaning of class, which is obviously about honor. I mean, a British-type class system is about assigning honor and dishonor to people on the basis of birth. That's basically what it is. And it was changing. I mean, it's not irrelevant that this dispute between Wellington and Winchelsea was about a bill that, among other things, was going to change the franchise and going to extend the franchise. And of course, it was a couple of years before the Great Reform Bill. It wasn't such a great reform, in my view, because most of the working people of England weren't included in the franchise, but at least it extended it. And it also cleaned up some of the more astonishing abuses of the system. So many things are going on in these cases. I think that the honor engagement that you see in someone like Kang Yu-wei, who's my sort of prototypical Mandarin, Chinese literati person whom I discuss in most detail, do reflect a kind of ripeness that was generated by the fact that for the literati, for that class of Chinese, that they had lived through half a century in which they kept losing from the British Opium Wars on. And they thought, we have the greatest civilization in the world. How can this little woman in England send 40 ships and command us to reopen the opium trade? How does that work? Why are we not able to do that? How can the French order us to admit Catholic, Christian, but in their particular case Catholic, missionaries all over our country, which we've never done before? We've never allowed foreigners to wander around. How can the Japanese, who are these pitiable neighbors who use our language, use our script, use our system of writing, beat us in the naval battle and force us into a humiliating treaty in the 1890s? So I think part of the background has to be a recognition that the system that this is part of is not working. And that's true with the class system in England that has to be reformed. It has to be reformed to admit what is now the powerful political class, which is the class of people who are getting rich in business, the new business class, and also a more effectively organized government. It's more bureaucratic and so on. You can't leave government in the hands of people whose qualification is that they were born to a title and have a large landed estate somewhere and so on. So the system isn't working, as it were. And I don't talk about this in the book, but since you asked the question, I think that is an important part of the background. And I don't particularly talk about it in Pakistan. But one thing that's clear to me, I haven't spent time in Pakistan, but it's easy nowadays to read the Pakistani newspapers on the web. There's something not working in Pakistan, right? And the elite knows this perfectly well, and lots of ordinary people know it too. So I think that's one of the most important rightness conditions, is a general sense that this is part of a way of doing things. It just isn't working. I think that that was true with anti-slavery. It wasn't, not economically not working, but it just, as notions of human dignity are slowly working their way out and people are beginning to grasp that it isn't just a privilege to have dignity with everybody, it just gets harder and harder to sort of look at yourself in the mirror when you're shaving and think, I have these slaves in the West Indies, and they aren't getting... So I think a kind of background of unease about the status quo, the sense that it's not working, is a very helpful sort of thing. What I think the honor is useful for is in kind of mobilizing people. It doesn't have to be, as I show in the case of the working class movement in England, the working people's movement, working men's movement. It doesn't have to be elite people. It has to be leaders of a certain sort, people who are, have a capacity for leadership, but they don't have to be from the current elite. I mean, look, this is I don't claim to have written a kind of cookbook for doing these things. I think there are many components. And the reason I focused on honor is because it's probably the component that's most counterintuitive and least discussed. Other people have talked about there's a whole sociology literature on social movements. And I don't deny that you've got to do that stuff as well. But to try and figure out what gets people in the first place, what gets the Kang Yu-Weis, who was the founder of the first foot binding movement, by first Chinese one. There were others founded by missionaries before. Well, he's a very interesting guy, but part of what gets him is the sense that he's a deeply committed Confucian. The Christians never had a remote chance of converting him to Christianity. But he sees that this thing isn't working, and he's trying to, it's a very intellectualized tradition, and he wants to figure out why. And this is one of the many things that he thinks is necessary, but he thinks it's an important one, and if you ask why, it's in part because he has this sense that these people who respect him see in this a source of a reason to disrespect him, to treat him with contempt, and he sees it as a reason, eventually, to, it undermines his self-respect. And so he refuses to bind the feet of his daughters, much to the annoyance of his family. And then he needs, as it were, help, so he gets other people who agree with him, some of whom have been abroad, and eventually he has a large organization. And as I say, once they got going, it happened very fast.
Garrett.
Thanks, Dr. Appiah. Gary Mitchell. I'm trying to make this not a cookbook question, and it's triggered somewhat by the comment that Jonathan Alterman just made about a ripeness.
Yeah.
I was thinking of two examples in this country. One that rises to the level of your three examples and the other does not. The first being capital punishment as a practice of a society, and the second has to do with what I think a great many people feel is happening to our politics. And I've been, I don't want to ask a cookbook question, but I would be
Nothing
interested in
wrong with cookbooks.
I would be interested in your thinking about whether and in what ways either of those two might be susceptible to using honor to change the honor code, if you will.
Well, I do think that there's, as I said, most honor codes have a kind of notion of honesty. In fact, it's written in our language, right? Honestas is the Latin for honor. I mean, it's written in the Latin language, but we borrowed only one of the senses because in Latin it can mean both. So part of so politics always involves performance and a kind of acting, but it also has to meet some kind of criterion, I think, of sort of sincerity. It has to be a performance that you have your heart in, that you actually mean. And there are many things that you might say are wrong with our politics today. And I think one of them is just vast amounts of performance that it doesn't meet that condition. And that's dishonorable. It's not honorable. It's fine to represent yourself in politics, but it's not fine to represent in politics in a way that's deeply inconsistent with your own inner thoughts about, what should be going on. It's also the case that, since honor is about entitlements to respect, that there's a deep disrespect for each other among the professional political class, but also, I think, a deep disrespect for the citizenry, which is connected with the dishonesty. That is, it's connected with this aspect of the performance, where you represent yourself as caring about and being guided by values that you aren't, that you think somehow are sort of popular out there. And I do think that the sense of sort of alienation from politics is very much tied up with the thought that it's not a very honourable business, as it's now. Has it ever been a hugely honourable business in either democratic or undemocratic societies? Perhaps not. But a concern for your honour was a key feature of American politics in the early republic. That's why Hamilton wasted his life, right? Think how much more he could have done for his country, which is what he wanted to do, if he hadn't been killed in that ridiculous way.
He wasn't even 50. I mean,
he was under 50. He was in his prime. He shouldn't have taken the bait, but he had anxiety about his own standing, and so he had to do it because he wanted to make sure that everybody knew he was a gentleman, which he sort of wasn't by some criteria. I mean, he had this sort of dubious ancestry, as it were. So, so I think that a lot of honor codes are about performance, and therefore it's consistent with politics, understood as something that necessarily involves performance. Sincerity in politics is just another kind of performance. So I don't want to suggest that what we should have is kind of, as it were, a Jimmy Carter politics in which we discuss what's going on in our intimate soul with the nation. That's not what I mean. I mean not trying to get people behind things by pretending that they are ways of pursuing things that you actually are when you're actually trying to pursue something else. And that is dishonorable, and I think that, as you can imagine, I'm not an adherent of what is now called the Tea Party, though it's not really a party, and it doesn't seem to involve much tea. But I sort of have some sympathy with some of the things those people say about the alienation they feel from our system. Now, it's not created just by politicians. I mean, a lot of it has to do with how our media culture works now. And again, if there were more people who cared about honor, maybe some of that would be better off. But I certainly don't have a recipe. But that honor matters in these ways, and that part of what's gone wrong is that it doesn't matter enough to some of the people who are most important in our country. I believe. You asked about something else first, John.
The first part was about capital punishment.
Oh, capital punishment. I have sort of very complicated views about capital punishment. I mean, there's my own feelings about it are very complicated. But what I do think is this: that if you look at what's involved in actually doing it in a rule of law society, it's probably not possible to do it in a way that fits with my conscience anyway. Even though many of the people whom we execute are people who've done terrible things of the sort that, if one could get rid of the mess, I wouldn't myself think made it inappropriate to think that we could execute them. So now, that's a kind of weak, it's not the strongest argument, It's not the argument the Catholic Church makes against capital punishment, which is much more straightforward. It's just I don't find myself totally convinced by that argument. But the point is stressing this is a weak argument. It's a weak argument. It's strong enough that it's persuaded almost every other serious rule of law country to give it up. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I think we should. And I do believe, look, this has happened in Europe, even though in polling it seems as though in some European countries a majority of people would favor the reintroduction of capital punishment. It's not going to happen, I don't think, because the law has shifted, the human rights law of Europe has shifted in a direction that it's now a condition of entering into the European Union that you abandon capital punishment if you still have it. I just think it would involve undoing too many things to do that. And as I say, because for the reason I gave you, I think that's good. But it isn't therefore the case that there's been a huge swing in public thinking about this. It is true, I was at school in England when capital punishment was abolished in England, and in the year afterwards there was a swing of public opinion against it. So the Parliament led the nation, that is, they voted to abolish it before most Britons were against it. But once they did do so, most Britons turned around and said, okay, well, probably it's...
We have time for perhaps a couple of quick questions if we can. Yes, the woman in the third row.
Hi,
If you could just wait for the microphone.
I'm Meg Poole, and I was wondering if in the book you comment on the role of the media in some of the more modern examples. And in your opinion, do you think the media help encourage a moral revolution, or does it just distort it?
Well, one of the places where I do talk about the media, and it's not in actually the most recent case, is I do think that part of what allowed ridicule to be turned against dueling was the growth of popular media, which represented this practice, which was an elite practice, which because it was illegal, it was written about in novels and so on, but you didn't, regular people didn't see or hear a lot about it. There was a lot of gossip about it, but gossip circulates within groups. It doesn't just... Once there was a popular press and there were cartoonists who were representing this, then the world of people whose respect was at stake was massively extended. And again, because it was a practice which gave honor to gentlemen by denying non-gentlemen the right to do it. If you weren't a gentleman, you couldn't duel. There was a kind of democratic impulse against it. That is, people who were not gentlemen had a reason to be against it, just as people who were working class had a reason to be against slavery because it implied their inferiority. Well, dueling implied the inferiority of the non-dueling classes, of the lower orders, the people who weren't gentlemen. So as a sort of media world is created, which includes all these other people who are not candidates for dueling, so I think media representations of practices are extremely important in producing some of these changes.
Another question here. Could you just wait for a second? Leah has a microphone.
I was intrigued by what you had to say about suicide bombers. I just saw Lawrence Wright's production, My Trip to Al-Qaeda. I wonder if you'd seen that.
No, I haven't, I'm afraid.
And if not, are there others who are examining the underpinnings of that psyche that you would look to, that you find maybe leading a moral revolution in that area?
I'm not going to be able to give you the names of authors of books apart from the author you just mentioned, who has written, that's based on a book of his. But again, I do think that at the heart of much of the resentment that drives what we call jihadi Muslims, not my favorite way of characterizing things, but still, you know what I mean when I say that, is a concern for the honor of Islam. I think that they feel that the West, or perhaps even in their minds Christendom, or perhaps Christians and Jews or something, has done things in the colonial period in the various invasions of Iraq, in supporting the Shah in Iran, and of course in supporting Israel, which have which reflect a kind of contempt for Muslim people and for Islam. And if you feel like that, first of all, they're right. Lots of people in the West do have contempt for Islam. And I do believe that that plays a role in making certain of our policies more acceptable than they would be if they weren't being directed at Muslims or societies that are identified as Muslim. I think that's all true. But if you think that, and you are a Muslim, then you've got an honor stake in the world, and you sort of lash out, right? After all, individuals do that. You go into a bar in, let's pick somewhere in the South, because that's the most honor-preoccupied part of our country, so let's say Tuscaloosa. Go into a bar in Tuscaloosa and insult a man's wife and see what people do when they think their honor has been infringed, right? If you're lucky, he'll ask you to take it outside, but he may start before then. So I think it's just on a global scale. It's sort of that phenomenon. And if you don't want that response, then you have to learn how to begin to make it true that you don't have contempt for Muslims, and then manifest that lack of contempt by respectful dialogue with Islam and with Muslims.
We just have a minute. Let me use moderator's prerogative and ask just a last question, and then Anthony will be answering. Will be signing books. Is there a moral issue that we haven't mentioned today that you would hope 100 years from now people would look back and say, "What were we thinking?"
Off the top of my head, I think of three. One is the scale and the character of incarceration in the United States. We're 4% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prisoners. We have more prisoners than any other country in the world, than China, a country that's many times our size, and I would have thought more repressive. I just think people will be, I think our great-grandchildren will just, they just won't understand how we live with this. And I haven't talked about what we do in the prisons. I've just talked about the numbers. So I think that's one. I think everybody in the room would volunteer something about industrial meat production. I mean, we have conditions for animals in many of our, the large-scale beef and pork production and chicken production, which are just, I think it's fine to eat animals myself. In fact, I have sheep, and some of them get eaten. But I think it's clearly wrong to cause animal suffering on that scale. And it's not necessary. My sheep don't suffer. So, and nor do large numbers of animals in meat production around the world. So I'm not, that's a different question. But the cruelty and the abuse of the animal, I think again, we'll just seem like weirdos that we didn't do something more about it. I think this is probably more controversial in this room anyway, but it wouldn't be controversial in my hometown. I think that the way we handle relations between older people sort of towards the end of their life and everybody else is really screwed up in our society.
Tell us
quickly
what you mean by that.
The difference between, so my mother, who was British but died in Ghana, died at home, surrounded by people, treated respectfully even as she was losing her faculties, not by just family, but by everybody. Everybody came by. Though she was sort of ready to die when she died, it wasn't because anyone was making life difficult for her. I mean, her body was letting her down. I think about whether I could have managed that for her in this country. And I don't, I'd have had to be much richer than I am, I think, to produce that for her. And my just sort of you know, if you've got a family, it's very hard in Ghana for older people who don't have family. That's a shame in Ghana. We don't do nearly enough. One of my mother's great projects when she was younger was working to improve the conditions in homes for elderly indigent people in my hometown. But if you have a family, they have a sense that they have set of responsibilities to you. That I think is
Sort of, to get back to your notion of dignity, it's maybe the ultimate dignity, death with dignity.
death with dignity, and end of life with dignity, not just you know the last period of your life when obviously some people are completely vital and don't need any of this. I'm not talking about them, but if you do need it, I'd rather hit that time in Ghana than here.
Thank you very, very much.